My friend, what is history, if not the shadow of truth? And what is truth in martial arts, if not the embodiment of human potential today? I speak to you not as an instructor of techniques, but as a fellow seeker on an eternal path, the history of Kung Fu. As most know, it is like a beautiful artwork that has been framed incorrectly. The image captivates, but the frame distorts its genuine meaning. When I hear folks speak of this history, they often recount tales of mystical monks, secret scrolls, and superhuman talents. They seek consolation in these myths. Legends are easier to understand than the raw intricacy of truth. Listen carefully. The most hazardous illusion in martial arts is not trickery by others, but self-deception. When we love the past without questioning it, we lock ourselves in a prison made by our own devotion. The actual masters throughout history were not people who treasured traditions like precious relics. They were ones who smashed restrictions to reveal new possibilities. History is not a temple to be visited on holidays. It is a foundry where understanding is pounded into wisdom. Again and again, generation after generation, the story of Kung Fu is not a straight line from origin to present. It is a living spiral where each turn both recognizes what came before and exceeds its constraints. Many approach the study of martial history by collecting names and dates, by memorizing lineages and cataloging forms. This is like studying the flight of an eagle by collecting its fallen feathers. You may know the components, but you will never comprehend the substance of its flight. The ancient masters did not receive perfection. They pursued effectiveness within their time and context. Their talent was not in making unchanging systems, but their relentless investigation into the nature of battle and human movement. The greatest honor we can show them is not to preserve their replies, but to continue their questions. When you look at history through eyes clouded by unthinking devotion, you perceive only what was. But when you look, clarity and purpose, history becomes a mirror reflecting not only what was, but what could be the past. Masters do not require disciples who mimic their forms. They require inheritors who embody their spirit of discovery. Therefore, I invite you to join me now in studying not simply the facts of Kung Fu history, but its beating heart, the eternal desire to comprehend ourselves through the language of action, the continual debate between human potential and the difficulties that reveal it. Let us begin with the name Kung Fu itself, a term that carries within its misreading the seeds of great perplexity. When Westerners hear Kung Fu, they think immediately of punches, kicks, and organized shapes. But this essential interpretation is already a departure from truth. In Cantonese Gang Fu or in Mandarin Gong Fu does not refer directly to martial arts. The phrase signifies skill attained through ways, signifies skill attained through time, practice, and focused work. One can have Kung Fu in calligraphy, in poetry, in cuisine, in any discipline. Where mastery shows through devoted refinement, it is the trait of excellence developed from perseverance, not the activity itself. This grammatical error is considerably more significant than a simple mistranslation. It demonstrates how we have degraded a vital concept about human development into a single category of physical processes. We have taken a philosophy of achievement and reduced it to a set of battle ways. The container has been misunderstood for what it contains. When I originally began my martial journey as a young man in Hong Kong, I too got ensnared in this mistake. I assumed that Kung Fu was something you possessed. Once you had studied enough tactics, enough forms, I collected motions and ways like treasures, believing their accumulation will finally equal to mastery. this was my first and perhaps most limiting illusion. It was only through years of training inquiry and careful thought, when I started to comprehend the phrase's real dimensions, this revelation transformed everything about my relationship with martial arts. I discovered that Kung Fu was not an achievement with an ultimate destination, but a quality of one's relationship with whatever discipline you do. It is not what you know, but how you have come to know it. Study this distinction carefully. Chinese martial arts were historically named Wu, meaning war art, whereas the quality of development through those was Kung Fu. One was the vessel, one was the process of filling it. But even this distinction fails to represent the dynamic nature of authentic Kung Fu, which perpetually expands the vessel even as it fills it. This inaccuracy in comprehending the phrase represents a deeper conceptual issue we create about martial arts history, just as we have mistaken the quality of development for the activities itself. We have often misunderstood the particular styles of martial arts throughout history, with its basic goal and values. Think of the martial traditions of China, not as set styles to be kept in amber, but as continual inquiries, investigation into the nature of conflict, of efficient movement of strategy, of the link between mind and body. Various investigations have taken diverse forms in different ages, reacting to different problems. Yet its essence transcends any particular set of approaches in my own journey. This knowledge released me. Stopped chasing the true version of martial art styles as if they were objects to be found. I began instead to ask what difficulties the old masters were seeking to solve, and how their solutions can inform my own explorations. This move from collecting answers to continuing questions changed not simply how I trained, but how I comprehended the fundamental history of what we now call Kung Fu. So while we explore this past together, remember that we are not simply following the growth of fighting tactics. We are investigating how generations of practitioners have handled the fundamental challenges of combat and self-development, each built upon, and occasionally this departing from what came before their Kung Fu was not simply in their skills, but in their process of discovery. And it is that process, not only its goods, that symbolizes the true legacy, shroud of mythology, and look into the original origins of what we now call Chinese martial arts. The romantic tales speak of enlightened monks and divinity inspiration, but the historical fact arises from something far more universal, human necessity. The earliest combat methods in China did not come from spiritual insight, but from the ruthless practicality of survival. When we analyze ancient military treatises, like the Sunbeam being distant from approximately 370 BC, we find lengthy explanations, not of mystical energy cultivation, but of battlefield tactics, weapon use and training methods, meant to create efficient warriors. These were not aesthetic pursuits, but real answers to existential challenges. China's history has been marked by cycles of unification and disintegration, of invasion and rebellion. Each moment of instability created settings where combat skills meant the difference between life and death. During the Warring States period, when 7 kingdoms fought for supremacy, martial development accelerated, not through meditation, however, with the crucible of continuous warfare. Tactics that failed faded together with those who used them. What survived did so because it worked this hard. Truth stands in stark contrast to the sanitized histories commonly portrayed today. The early masters were not calm sages delivering wisdom from mountain retreats. Many were military, officers, bodyguard, guards, rebels, or plain folk battling to safeguard their towns. Their concerns were immediate and practical. How to beat an armed opponent, how to survive when outnumbered, how to train fighting skills, efficiently consider the socio-political dynamics that shaped these advances when the general people were disallowed to carry weapons over several dynasties, unarmed combat ways flourished, not spiritual practices, but as essential responses to when Mongol invaders threatened with their superior cavalry and archery. Chinese fighting methods devised particular responses to these risks. Each political reality created distinct martial concerns demanding specific solutions. Archaeological findings, military manuals. Because historical documents indicate something fundamental about early Chinese martial arts. They were extremely direct and focused totally on effectiveness. The movements were not supposed to be attractive or to reflect philosophical concepts. They were developed to work under pressure, to be learned fast, and to provide actual advantages in battle. Even the training method techniques reflected this practical attitude before the grandiose solo forms that many identify with Kung Fu today. Training concentrated on partner drills, conditioning exercises, and simulated battle. The goal was functional skill, not aesthetic perfection. When we analyze historical military examinations, we find tests of strength, speed, and fighting ability, not appraisals of how nicely a solo style was performed. In my personal studies and practice, this understanding of martial origins changed my approach. I discovered that the creators of diverse fighting systems were not seeking to create art. They were overcoming difficulties. Their innovations come not from following to tradition, but from the freedom to explore, to test, to eliminate what failed, and refined. What perhaps this pragmatic mindset is what made effective. Martial arts, not strict adherence to preset patterns. This perspective challenges people who consider martial arts as essentially cultural items or spiritual practices. While these dimensions eventually existed, they were secondary developments. The cornerstone was combat effectiveness. When we lose sight of its initial objective, we risk keeping the shell of tradition, but losing its essence core. Look at how fighting systems developed differently in various regions of China northern styles, with their emphasis on long-range kicking methods reflected the open terrain and the influence of cavalry. Warfare southern styles, with their emphasis on sturdy stance and close-range hand movements, exhibited dense urban surroundings and naval combat experiences. They were not arbitrary stylistic decisions, but responses to specific settings and challenges. What I find most enlightening about these historical roots is not the specific techniques that arose, but the process via which they were developed. The willingness to face reality directly, to test methods against resistant opponents, to evolve based on results rather than prejudices. This method, this unyielding pragmatism, offers the actual cornerstone of martial excellence that we would do well to recover today. The original martial spirit was not about conserving forms, but about solving challenges. It was not about keeping to style, but on having effective talents for certain contexts. When we comprehend this, we can explore the rich historical legacy of Chinese martial arts, not as a museum to conserve, but as a workshop where the effort of refining and adaptation continues with each generation. What changed these pragmatic fighting strategies become deep methods of self-cultivation. This is possibly the most fascinating part of Chinese martial arts history, how combat skills became vehicles for intellectual study and personal transition as Chinese culture progressed, and times of relative stability. The martial arts grew to adopt and reflect the dominant philosophical systems of Chinese culture. This was not only ornamentation. Given to fighting techniques, it was a profound reconceptualization of what martial practice could mean for human development. Confucianism, with its emphasis on social harmony and correct connections, combined martial arts training with ethical dimensions. The concept of Wu-Dai martial virtue evolved. The practitioner realized that physical power without ethical restraint was hazardous, and ultimately self-defeating fighting skill become inseparable from character development. The martial artist was meant to exhibit values of loyalty, righteousness, kindness, and wisdom, not just combat effectiveness. I have witnessed how this Confucian influence generated a framework where martial arts become a tool for building the ideal person, someone who could fight effectively, but opted to use this skill wisely and justly. This transformed what may have remained ordinary combat methods into a path of character enhancement. The ultimate objective of training was not to defeat others, but to perfect oneself simultaneously. Taoist philosophy offered deep concepts about naturalness, balance, and strategic intelligence to martial development. The principles of surrendering rather than resisting directly, of using an opponent's force against them, of finding the path of least resistance. These concepts revolutionized combat tactics. The tossed comprehension of complementary opposites, yin and yang, gave a foundation for understanding how softness could conquer hardness, how circular movement could defeat linear force. What I find most significant about this twist effect is how it altered focus from pure physical strength to clever application of force. The finest talent was not to overwhelm an opponent with power, but to neutralize their attack with least effort. This principle of economy, of producing most result with lowest effort, became central to advanced martial arts. It is not about what you do, but about what you do not do. The needless moves you eliminate, but probably the most profound transformation comes through Chan Buddhism, understood in the Buddhism West as Zen. This wasn't only about integrating meditation to fighting tactics. It was a comprehensive reconceptualization of the link between mind and body. Tan Buddhism taught that dualistic thinking, separating mind from body self, from other technique, from principle, was an illusion that hindered genuine understanding. Through this lens, martial arts become a vehicle for directly seeing reality beyond conceptual thinking. The practitioner learns to act from a level of united awareness, where there was no division between intention and action, between knowing and doing the state, which the Japanese eventually dubbed Mushin, or no mind, signified the highest level of martial success in my own development. I began to recognize how these philosophical dimensions were not separate from combat effectiveness, but way to its ultimate expression. The ethical framework of Confucianism prevented the misuse of expertise that would inevitably produce opponents and lead to downfall. The strategic intelligence of Taoism ensured victory without relying on superior power. The unified awareness of Chan Buddhism permitted immediate responsiveness without the delay of conscious deliberation. My own philosophy of Jundu depicts a synthesis of these traditions not as historical objects must be retained intact, but as living concepts to be understood and articulated according to one's individual nature. From Confucianism, I took the pledge to sincerity and self-cultivation. From Taoism, I embrace non-sea conflict and the water-like character of flexibility. From Chan Buddhism, I incorporated direct experience beyond the limitations of styles and forms. What we witness in this philosophical revolution is something astonishing. Fighting strategies evolved for survival, became platform for investigating the deepest concerns of human existence. How should we live? How may we blend with natural principles? How can we transcend our limiting self-concept? These questions found expression not just merely in literature and teachings, but in the lived experience of martial training. This blend of philosophical depth with martial effectiveness marks one of China's greatest cultural achievements. Nevertheless, we must realize that this shift did not make martial arts less useful. It made them more profound while keeping their functional essence. The philosophical dimension were not substitutes for military combat effectiveness, but expansions of it into broader domains of human growth throughout Chinese history. The greatest improvements in martial arts come not from those who kept traditions unaltered, but from those who responded to new challenges. This is a crucial understanding that has been largely forgotten in current times. The true tradition of martial arts is not preservation, but innovation. Observe what happened when China experienced Mongol invaders throughout the Sung and Yuan dynasties. The Mongols were physically larger, rode mighty horses, and employed terrible archery. Considering the present Chinese martial systems developed largely for infantry warfare vs. similar opponents unexpectedly confronted an existential crisis. How did the masters of that respond? Not by sticking firmly to established practices, but by establishing new together. They devised techniques emphasizing redirection rather than direct, opposing key point, hitting rather than overwhelming force, evasive footwork rather than rigid postures. These innovations weren't betrayals of tradition. They were tradition functioning as it was supposed to adapt to solve immediate and pressing issues. When firearms came to dominate battlefields during the Ming Dynasty, making many conventional weaponry obsolete, martial artists again faced a dilemma: preserve methods developed for outmoded contexts, or adapt. The most visionary masters selected evolution, changing focus from battlefield applications to personal self-defense, internal development, and enhanced skill manifestation. This wasn't a corruption of martial arts, yet there required reinvention. The famous systems we things today were not given down from heaven perfectly formed. They were made by individuals responding creatively to the challenges of their day. Qing's founder, Ge Jike, refined his art's linear explosive power to breach the armor and formations of opposing soldiers' wing. Chan's strict economic activities were supposedly aimed to overcome the advantages of larger, stronger opponents. Tai Chuan's subtle yielding and redirection concepts arose as a sophisticated response to the limitations of meeting with a force. This historical pattern tells something significant. The true masters were not preservationists, they were innovator. They honored their predecessors not by reiterating their answers, but by continuing their process of inquiry and adaptability. They knew that martial excellence is not static. It is alive, constantly growing in response to new situations and difficulties. I got to this understanding from both historical studies and personal experience when I began to doubt the limitations of typical training approaches. Many accused me of disrespectful heritage, but my deeper study of martial history proved that I was actually embracing the true spirit of tradition, the spirit of adaptation and evolution that had always characterized the great masters. What we call traditional martial arts were once innovative innovations. The forms and procedures now held as sacrosanct were once radical. Divergence from what came before. The founders of these systems were not looking backward. They were handling the difficulties of their present moment. Using innovative intelligence, their innovations became traditions only after their deaths, when successive generations began to maintain, rather than continue their path of evolution. This insight impacted my perception of my own role in martial arts history. I learned that the highest respect I could give to the great of the past was not to copy their answers, but to embody their questioning spirit, not to preserve their solutions, but to continue their inquiry, not to be bound by their conclusions, but to be inspired by their approach in developing Gundu, understood. I was not discarding tradition, but reconnecting with its deeper essence, its adaptable, responsive nature. When I urged absorbing what is useful, rejecting what is useless, and adding what is distinctively your own, I was describing a principle that the greatest masters throughout history had always followed, albeit rarely expressed clearly. This concept of martial history as constant adaptation rather than static preservation liberates us. It means we don't need to choose between appreciating the past and addressing the present. The genuine tradition of martial arts is the tradition of progress itself, of handling each new issue with the same inventive intellect that inspired the founders of numerous styles. Glance closely at any martial system that has persisted, and you will discover not strict orthodoxy, but clever adaptability. The systems that fail to evolve eventually become irrelevant or ornamental, preserved like insects in amber, visible, but no longer alive. The systems that continue to adapt remained crucial, effective, and meaningful across changing situations and generations. The animal styles of Chinese martial arts have captured imaginations for centuries. Tiger, crane, snake, mantis, dragon, these systems appear to be exact imitations of animal movements, but this superficial comprehension ignores its depth. Essence, the ultimate brilliance of animal styles, rests not in mimicking, but in fundamental. When the ancient master ears spotted the snake, they weren't only mimicking its crawling motion, they were sensing something considerably deeper, noteworthy. The snake's ability to create power from a condition of total relaxation, to strike with precision from stillness, to use its entire body as an integrated unit. The physical resemblance between snake tactics and genuine peak motions is significantly less important than these basic ideas. Consider the mantis style. A simplistic approach indicates practitioners are simply emulating the insect's unique forearms and sharp movements. However, the actual insight of mantis boxing is about strategic concepts, the principle of simultaneous defense and assault, the economics of trapping strategies, the psychological timing of intercepting an opponent at the moment of their commitment. These concepts transcend sheer. Copying the tiger style wasn't valued because practitioners could persuasively replicate a tiger's look. Was intended to embody certain power generation technologies, the synchronization of breath with intense muscular contraction, The structural alignment that allows maximum force transmission is a psychological quality of decisive commitment to action. These concepts are relevant regardless matter whether the approaches visually resemble a tiger in the crane style, the premise of balance mixed with precision, hitting matters significantly more than whether practitioners stand on one leg like the bird. The crane's capacity to sustain structural integrity during extending reach to recover position after stretching to strike with focused accuracy. These are the meaningful principles that transcend mere mimicking. This divide between mimicry, the main extraction, illustrates something fundamental about martial development. The greatest masters weren't designing systems based on surface appearances, but on functional principles observed in nature. They employed animals as conceptual frameworks to organize and impart complex biomechanical and strategic concepts in my own training. This insight impacted how I approached these established systems rather than asking, how can I make my actions look more like this animal? I began asking, what useful principle is this animal embodying? And how can I assimilate that principle, regardless of external form, from the snake? I extracted the idea of relaxed power, the potential to generate force without telegraphing intention by preliminary tension. From the crane, I absorbed the idea of precision over power, recognizing that a precisely delivered lesser force typically achieves more than a powerful but imprecise one from the tiger. I integrated the idea of dedicated activity, complete psychological investment in each movement, without reservation. This principle-centered approach liberates us from fixating on artistic appearances, while allowing us to recognize the significant lessons hidden within these traditional systems. It enables us to go beyond the restrictions of literal interpretation while keeping the function wisdom. These styles contain. The beast styles weren't designed to be outfits we wear or movements. Pretend they were sophisticated conceptual frameworks designed to impart complicated principles using simple analogies. When we grasp this, we progress from being collectors of tactics to students of principles, from outward mimicry to internal comprehend, standing throughout Chinese history. Arts have followed a fascinating rhythm, a cycle of innovation, followed by codification, then stagnation, and finally revolution. Comprehending this pattern shows not merely the past, but also the existing problems and future potential of martial development. When we examine the historical record closely, we may see this rhythm playing out frequently throughout eras of instability and conflict. Martial arts evolved fast, new techniques arose, old approaches were tried and refined, and pragmatic effectiveness was the fundamental priority. The martial artists of these periods were not preservationists, but creators responding creatively to acute risks and problems. Then a society stabilized, eased, and urgent hazards receded. A time of codification would commence. The improvements that proven beneficial was systematized, catalogued, and arranged into coherent instructional techniques. This codification provided an important goal. It maintained hard-won knowledge and made it transmissible to future generations. What had been the personal expressions of inventive individuals become structured structures that might be taught more widely. Nevertheless, this process of codification had within it the seeds of stagnation as generations passed. What were once dynamic breathing responses to actual combat circumstances gradually converted to ritualized patterns and predefined patterns. The original context and goal of movements become hidden. Students began to focus on duplicating the outer form of approaches rather than grasping their core concepts and applications. This paralysis manifested in numerous ways training practices that were formerly supposed to develop genuine fighting talents become increasingly abstract and distant from aggressive actual forms that were originally mnemonics for fighting methods became performances assessed on aesthetic standards rather than utilitarian effectiveness. The inquisitive spirit that had motivated innovation was replaced by reverence for tradition and acceptance of inherited wisdom. The most distressing element of this stagnation was how it inverted the relationship between form and function. In the innovative phase, function-dictated form techniques were determined by their efficacy in solving genuine combat difficulties, but in the stagnation period, form began to govern. Function practitioners started with preset movements and then sought excuses for them, rather than starting with problems and building solutions. Yet, the story doesn't stop with stagnation throughout history. Visionary individual Ewell have evolved who understood the limitations of calcified traditions and established new phases of innovation. These revolutionary leaders often encountered fierce pushback from established authorities, but eventually reinvigorated martial arts by reconnecting them with its practical origins and innovative spirit. I saw this pattern not simply in distant past, but in the martial arts landscape of my own time. Many schools have become museums conserving techniques without understanding, prioritizing conformity above utility. Students were taught what to think, rather than how to think, what to do, rather than why to do it. The inquisitive mentality required to marshal progress had been replaced by unthinking acceptance of established forms and methods. This concept greatly affected my philosophy of constant progress. I came to recognize that the greatest respect I could offer to martial tradition was not to regard it as a final result, but as a continual process. The genuine tradition of martial arts is not the preservation of forms, but the continuance of that evolutionary spirit that has always defined its most vital phases. When I spoke of being formless, less like water, I was conveying this idea of martial evolution, that water doesn't stick to one shape, it adjusts to its container. It flows around obstacles. It finds the path of least resistance. This is not only a lyrical metaphor, but a fundamental principle that has always controlled true martial evolution. The most hazardous trap in martial arts is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge, the notion that the systems we have acquired constitute the ultimate word, rather than way. Points in a continuous journey when we mistake the map for the area, when we confuse the teaching technique for the reality. It points toward we get locked in forms that may no longer suit their original function. This cycle of innovation, codification, stagnation, and revolution teaches us something profound. Martial arts are not static relics, but living traditions that must always refresh themselves to remain vital. The health of any martial system may be assessed not by how faithfully it retains its history, but by how effectively it addresses present difficulties while keeping open to future evolution. The history of Chinese martial arts displays a remarkable propensity for reinvention over changing dynasties, given societal situation. Began primarily as battlefield techniques transformed many times as the environment and aim of fighting evolved across Chinese history. During the Han Dynasty, the martial arts were predominantly military specialties, focusing on training soldiers for coordinated warfare. The tactics emphasized weapon use, formation fighting, and battlefield effectiveness. Individual expression was subservient to collective military necessity. The martial artist was first and primarily a combatant safeguarding state interests as we advance through the Tang and Song dynasties. We see martial arts beginning to develop civilian applications alongside their military because, as urban centers expanded and commerce flourished, personal self-defense became increasingly major martial arts developed to adapt to this context, focusing more on unarmed, using solo battle rather than organized warfare and disputes in enclosed areas rather than open battlefields. The Mongol conquest during the Yuan dynasty prompted another transition when Chinese were outlawed from bearing guns, or because for military training, martial arts moved. Clandestine training methods had to be camouflaged as health activities or folk dances. What can appear to be a restriction really boosted innovation. Practitioners produced approaches that might be done individually and covertly, yet still cultivate true combat skill. The Ming Dynasty witnessed maybe the most significant transformation. The fusion of martial arts with academic and medical traditions, what had long been primarily combat methods, grew to be seen as strategies for building health, ethical character, and spiritual insight. Thus wasn't a rejection of martial effectiveness, but an expansion of purpose, realizing that the principles that guided effective fighting also given knowledge for effective living by the Qing dynasty, with the proliferation of weapons rendering traditional warfare methods increasingly outdated on the combat martial arts, underwent yet another mutation. They became vehicles for retaining cultural identity amid foreign control methods, for growth and strategies for fostering the body-mind relationship in an increasingly me-ized world. What I find most crucial about these transformations is not that martial arts changed, it's how they changed. Each evolution wasn't a rejection of what gone before, but a recontextualization of key concepts. To address new conditions, the exterior forms shifted, but the fundamental discoveries about human movement, psychology, and battle dynamics remained important across dramatically varied situations. This historical perspective impacted my understanding of what martial arts must become in our current era. We face challenges unseen to previous generations: global mobility that brings multiple fighting styles into contact, scientific understanding of human biomechanics and psychology, urban settings that restrict traditional training methods, legal systems that prohibit the application of combat tactics. Such a world, martial arts cannot remain static museums of ancient technology. They must once again adapt their forms while keeping their key insights. The modern martial artist isn't prepared for medieval battlefield circumstances or imperial court duels. We prepare for modern self-defense scenarios, for personal growth in a technology age, for psychological equilibrium in a demanding world. This necessary alteration doesn't degrade tradition, it continues tradition's most significant aspect, its adaptation to changing conditions. The martial arts that survive and thrive in the modern world will be those that can extract their timeless concepts from their time-constrained forms, retaining what remains important, while innovating to answer modern difficulties. One of the most persistent misconceptions about Chinese martial arts is that they developed in splendid isolation, untouched by extraneous influences. This narrative of culture purity is not simply historically wrong. It obscures of the most fascinating features in martial arts development, the vast exchange of combat expertise across cultural borders throughout history. China has engaged in continual cultural exchange with adjacent cultures. The Silk Road didn't simply convey products between East and West. It transferred concepts, include martial concepts. When we investigate historical records and archaeological evidence, we find obvious indicators of cross-cultural influences in weapon designs, combat tactics, and training systems. Consider the linkages between Indian martial traditions and Chinese systems. The historical evidence reveals considerable interchange between both cultures. Skills from Indian wrestling and staffways appear to have impacted certain Chinese forms. The concept of key point hitting displays tremendous commonalities among these traditions that cannot be exploring the relationship between Chinese martial arts and those of Central Asia shows another dimension of this exchange. The horsemanship and archery of Mongol, Turkic, and other steppe peoples both challenged and inspired Chinese fighting skills when faced with mounted warriors from the North Chinese martial systems have to adjust and include new techniques to counter these problems. This wasn't a corruption of indigenous traditions, but an evolution driven by cross-cultural encounter, even inside what we now call China. Diverse regions and ethnic groups developed distinct fighting approaches that inspired each other. The martial arts of the Norn Plains, with their concentration on long-range methods and mobility, cross-pollinated with southern systems that emphasized stability and close-range fighting. Hoka martial arts shared concepts with neighboring traditions while preserving their distinct character. Japan, Korea, Okinawa, and Southeast Asian nations all participated in this continual exchange of martial knowledge, with China weapon designs, training methods, and tactical concepts migrated across these permeable cultural barriers in multiple directions. When we evaluate the staff tactics of Southeast Asia alongside Southern Chinese ways, or compare various Japanese weapon arts with their Chinese equivalents, the evidence of mutual effect becomes obvious. What I find most significant about this historical truth is how it undermines the narrative of purity that many martial traditions have developed. The strength of Chinese martial arts never came from solitude, but from their ability to absorb, integrate, and convert diversity influences like a great river fueled by many rivers. Chinese martial arts become richer through each cultural exchange, incorporating useful aspects while preserving their essential concepts. In my own approach, I embrace this multicultural martial heritage rather than denying it. I researched systems from different cultures: Wing Chun from China, Western boxing, Filipino martial arts, Japanese karate, Western fencing, acknowledging that efficient values persist across cultural barriers. This wasn't a rejection of my Chinese heritage, but an expression of its truest tradition, the openness to learn from all sources. The idea of cultural separation meets a psychological demand for uncomplicated storylines and pure origins, yet it does a disservice to the complicated, intertwined reality of martial growth. The genuine history of martial arts is not one of separate parallel streams, but of a huge network of rivers and tributaries running in multiple routes, sometimes merging, sometimes diverging, but always related in a continual exchange of knowledge. When we realize this history of exchange, we free ourselves from false limits. We can honor specific cultural traditions while acknowledging that the pursuit of martial excellence has always transcended cultural bounds. The question isn't whether a technique or philosophy comes from our past or theirs, but whether it works, whether it conveys truth, whether it leads to greater understanding. Let me share with you my personal journey through the world of martial arts, not as an example for you to follow, but as an example of how one man navigated the complicated link between tradition and personal truth. My story is not independent from the greater history we've been discussing. It is one manifestation of the eternal tension between form and freedom, between the wisdom of the past and the responsibilities of the moment. I began, like many do a young man, learning traditional techniques from reputed teachers. In Hong Kong, I studied Wing Chun beneath Ip Man, embracing its efficient principles, its economy of motion, its deep comprehension of close-range fighting. I practiced the forms, refined the skills, sparred with classmates, following the customary path of transmission that has prevailed for generations. There was tremendous wisdom in this instruction, the precision of movement, the emphasis on centerline control, the concept of simultaneous assault and defense. These ideas remain essential regardless of style or era. My regard for this foundation has never lessened, even as my path deviated from orthodoxy. As I pursued my training and began teaching others, I experienced a rising frustration with stagnant approaches to martial arts. I noted how many schools had become closed systems, repeating patterns without completely knowing them, maintaining procedures without testing them, addressing inquiries with because the style dictates it rather than with functional explanations. This rigidity contradicted everything I was taught about genuine battle. Real fighting is fluid, unexpected, dynamic. It cannot be restrained within established patterns. The gap between classical training methods and military reality became clear and distressing to me. My findings lead me to doubt not just certain techniques, but whole training paradigms. I began to understand how many classic approaches, while holding excellent principles, were imprisoned in cultural and historical phrases, works that sometimes hid rather than illuminated their inherent truths. The container had become more important than what it contained. This revelation did not lead me to discard tradition, but to connect with it more intimately, to look beyond its superficial expressions to its core concepts. I wasn't interested in disregarding the lessons of past masters, but in obtaining their own essential wisdom from cultural and historical accretions that were no longer relevant. The turning point came when I experienced a back ailment that caused me to re-evaluate everything, unable to train like I had before. I had to discover new ways this constraint become a gateway to liberation. During my recovery, I delved thoroughly into texts on various fighting arts, Western boxing, wrestling, fencing, studying their principles rather than just their approaches. I began to find patterns across seemingly disparate systems, basic principles stated using different cultural lenses. This validated what my historical studies had indicated, that martial excellence transcends style and culture, that there are universal laws of efficient movement and battle effectiveness that exist apart of any particular system. This led to the establishment of my philosophy of personal truth in martial arts. I came to believe that each practitioner must finally discover their own way informed, but not bound by tradition. The martial arts path is not about adhering to other norms, but rather discovering your own remark, about disclosing rather than adding. When I replied, I have no way as the approach, and no limitation as the limitation I was conveying, this realizing genuine mastery doesn't come from perfecting a predetermined path, but from transcending the fundamental concept of roots, from reaching beyond the limitations of style to straightforward exposition of concept. My historical research and personal discovery got entangled in a continual dialogue. The more I understood martial history as a process of adaptation and evolution rather than static preservation, the more freedom I felt to continue that progress in my own, practice, and the more I investigated first-hand experience through training combat, the more clearly I could distinguish between classic Kal concepts that remained important and historical forms that had outlived their context. This personal quest taught me something important about martial arts. Learning transmission involves not just a teacher transmitting techniques to a student, but a student internalizing concepts so thoroughly that they become capable of their own expressiveness. The greatest gift a teacher can provide is not a flawless imitation of their own work, but the skills for pupils to explore their own. My journey was not a rejection of history, but a different relationship with it, seeing the past not as a template to follow, but as a conversation to continue, not as an end point, but as a foundation, not as a constraint, but as a springboard. In this way, my personal quest became part of the very history I was studying, another turn in the spiral of martial evolution that has persisted for ages. When we look at martial arts merely as sets of skills, we miss their real essence. Throughout history, the greatest moments in martial growth happened when practitioners moved beyond techniques to the concepts behind them. This transcendence of the technical dimension shows the greater purpose and potential of martial arts. Analyze how many practitioners approach their training, documenting skills, gathering forms, collecting tactics as if martial knowledge were only an issue of quantity. Constituted mastery, but technical accumulation without main center understanding is like gathering words without learning grammar. You may own many components, but lack the capacity to construct something. Expressions from my personal experience, I found that true growth comes not from adding new skills, but from expanding your understanding of fundamental ideas. When I learned in Wing Chun, I originally focused on understanding the skills of the system. The Tansa Bonga Lapa drills the Su Lin Tao form. But my breakthrough occurred when I began to understand the ideas. These methods included center line, control economy of motion, simultaneous assault, and defense susceptibility to pressure. If I comprehend these principles, I discovered they may be articulated by various technical variations beyond the canonical motions of the style. The specific techniques, were essentially particular expressions of universal principles. This insight released me from technical obsession and opened the door to principle-based. Recognizing this exact trend repeats frequently in martial history. Consider the famous masters we revere: Wang F, Hang Dong, Han Chen, Phony, Yang Luchan. What made them exceptional wasn't just their technical repertoire, but their thorough comprehension of ideas. They didn't only preserve ways, they embodied principles so profoundly that they could convey them spontaneously in any situation. These masters weren't valued. While they knew more tactics than others, they were esteemed because they comprehended the substance behind techniques, the ideas that give techniques their life and purpose. They could apply these principles in unusual settings, reacting immediately to unexpected difficulties. Their mastery wasn't rigorous commitment to form, but flowing expression of essence. The link between ancient masters and their innovations demonstrates this point. Plainly, the founders of numerous styles weren't principally technique inventors. They were principle discoverers. They spotted patterns, connections, and concepts that transcended specific movements. The techniques they devised were vehicles for these ideals, not the principles themselves. This gap between technique and principle isn't only philosophical. It affects how we perform and interpret martial arts. When we exercise with principle-concentrated awareness, every movement becomes an adventure rather than a replication. Every practice session becomes discovery rather than repetition. every challenge becomes a chance for better knowledge rather than a test of memorized answers. My view of martial arts as a vehicle for human potential derives from this insight. When we move beyond technical cataloging to principle, the martial arts become not only tools of fighting, but pathways for human development. Characteristics that control effective combat awareness, adaptability, efficiency, harmony between purpose and action are the same principles that govern effective living. The finest expression of martial arts isn't technical perfection, but the synthesis of physical action with mental clarity. Spiritual freedom, the greatest masters throughout history, weren't simply skilled fighters. They were persons who had used martial training as a means to realize their full human. Having this perspective alters how we react to the martial past. The skills of the old masters matter less the principles they uncovered and the process by which they discovered them. Their greatest legacy isn't a database of movements, but an approach to understanding movement itself. When we grasp this essence beyond technique, we honor heritage not by retaining its forms unmodified, but by continuing its forms. Process of inquiry, we revere the masters not by copying their responses, yet by embracing their questions. We develop the art not by adding to its technological inventory, but by expanding our knowledge of its basic principles. This principle-based method reconnects martial arts with their highest purpose, not only teaching us how to fight, but helping us realize who we are and what we can become beyond self-defense, beyond physical fitness, beyond cultural preservation. Lies this deep potential. Martial arts is a platform for investigating human capacity for merging body, mind, and spirit. For merging body, mind. Expressing individual truth through disciplined action. As we close our overview of martial history, I want to share with you what I believe is the ongoing legacy of this old wisdom, not as a definitive answer, but as an invitation to your own discovery. The true history of Kung Fu isn't documented in scrolls or books or even in the forms and practices transmitted down through generations. It's recorded in the lived experience of innumerable practitioners who throughout the centuries used this skill as a method to comprehend themselves and their world. This history isn't done it, continues with each of us who interact seriously with this path. The question we must individually answer is how to appreciate this rich heritage while remaining loyal to its innovative spirit. My answer is this: we honor the past not through preservation, but through evolution. The greatest respect we can offer to masters who came before us isn't to freeze their creativity in time, but to keep it alive via ongoing growth and development. Remember, the old masters didn't inherit perfection. They created effectiveness for their time. They faced their troubles. We must face ours. They found their truths. We must find ours. They weren't restricted by their predecessors. We shouldn't be restricted by them. This isn't disrespect. It's the highest kind of esteem, viewing them as pioneers rather than mere caretakers. When I look at martial history as a whole, I see not a memorial to be kept, but an ongoing exploration, an exploration of human movement of battle, principles of the link between mind and body, of the absolute limits of human potential. Each generation has added to this exploration, adding their results, questioning prior beliefs, broadening boundaries of what was deemed conceivable. This perspective liberates us from the burden of perfect reproduction and welcomes us into the journey of ongoing discovery. It transforms our relationship with the past from one of subservience to one of discussion. We can appreciate the insights of preceding generations. To this living tradition, my final perspective on martial history is this: isn't a story of what was, but a process that continues to be a way of discovering human potential through the link between mind, body, and soul. When viewed, this perspective history becomes not a weight that attaches us to the past, but a foundation that supports our growth toward future. This is the profound insight I've obtained via years of study practice and reflection. The greatest martial artists throughout history weren't those who collected the most techniques or maintained traditions unchanged. These were those who penetrated to the essential principles of human movement and combat, who expressed these beliefs with honesty and directness, who responded continuously to changing conditions while preserving touch to core principles. This insight bridges past, present, and future in a single continuous stream, the same principles that drove the development of martial arts millennia ago. Efficiency, directness, adaptation, harmony between intention and action remain vital today and will continue to guide honest practitioners in the future. The exterior forms may alter, but the core ideas survive as you continue your own trip in martial arts, whether as practitioner or merely as student of its history. I encourage you to approach this subject not as a museum of ancient artifacts, but as a living laboratory of human potential. Perceive oneself not as a custodian of fixed information, but as a contributor to a continuous exploration. Remember that in the end, all the techniques, all the forms, all the systems are simply various fingers pointing to the same moon, and the moon they point to is self-knowledge. Don't focus too hard on the fingers that you miss the heavenly glory. They signify the genuine core of Kung Fu, beyond styles and approaches, beyond histories and lineages, is reflected in. By knowing yourself not as a permanent entity, but as a process of becoming, not as distinct from the environment, but as part of it, not as bound by limitations, but as continually overcoming them. This is the greatest wisdom of martial history, that through this particular discipline of battle preparation, generations of practitioners have uncovered universal principles, understand human nature and human potential. When we engage with this history in its purest form, we participate in this ongoing discovery. We become not simply pupils of the past, but creators of the future. In this sense, the history of Kung Fu isn't just something we study, it's something we live. It's not just something we preserve, it's something we continue. Not only something we receive, but something we contribute to this living interaction with history is, I feel, the truest manifestation of appreciation for the amazing journey that carried martial arts from its ancient origins to our present moment, and that continues to evolve toward a future we aid to create.